Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to EWC Insights Asia Pacific Transitions. My name is Panwin Yoking. I am a research fellow at the East-West Center. And for today's session, we have a panel discussion on China's 20th Party Congress. And our panelists are Kim Fassler, Danny Roy, and Teresa Wright. Kim Fassler is an adjunct fellow at the East-West Center. She's also a senior analyst at the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command's China Strategic Focus Group. She has been with the U.S. Department of Defense for 11 years, including assignments in Washington, D.C. and Beijing. Her research interests are China's political and military leadership and decision-making. Danny is a senior fellow at the East-West Center, whose work focuses mostly on Asia-Pacific security issues, particularly those involving China. And Teresa is currently a visiting scholar at the East-West Center. She's also a professor of political science at California State University, Long Beach. And her research focuses on state-society relations, protests and dissent, and the relationship among capitalism, democracy, and authoritarianism, particularly in China and Taiwan. And in terms of logistics, Kim will start us off with her 15-minute talk on why the party thinks it is a critical political event for China's development, and also its implication on US and China interaction over the next 5 years. Then Danny will comment on some of the implications of the Congress for foreign policy issues. And Teresa will then be focusing on the recent protest activities and general societal, political, and attitudes and behavior. After that, we will transition to a Q&A session, and I encourage all attendees to participate by sharing your questions for Kim, Danny, and or Teresa in the Q&A box. And we will try our best to get through as many questions as possible. And before I turn the stage over to the panelists, I would like to make a short announcement that Jennifer Turner of Wilson Center will be our next EWC Insights speaker, and her talk will be on November 16th at 2 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. And without further ado, over to you, Kim, to start your talk.
Well, thank you, Panwin, and good afternoon or good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. It is a real pleasure to participate in this event in what is a very exciting week in China's political calendar. I just wanted to say mahalo to the East-West Center for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts on China's Party Congress, which started last weekend and which has really captured attention around the world. Before I start, I am obliged to state that the views I'm about to present are my own views, and they do not necessarily represent those of the Department of Defense or the Indo-Pacific Command. Now, I've been an analyst with the US government for more than 10 years and a student of Chinese politics for a few years more than that. And in fact, I took my first Chinese language class just down the street from the East-West Center at a high school that was attended by China's first president. And in all that time, I can confidently say that I have never seen a Chinese political event attract this much international attention as the one this week. And in fact, I believe the East-West Center this is their second Party Congress event in 2 weeks. And so I think that this reflects not just the dramatic rise of China in our national consciousness and our national strategies, but the very high stakes of this meeting and it coming at a very profound moment for China and the relationship between our two countries. So before we get started, I think some of you may be asking, what is a Party Congress and why is it so important? Well, a Party Congress is important for many reasons. Two of them are that it results in personnel selections. And the second reason is that it helps the party leadership set the priorities that is going to pursue over the next 5 years. So every 5 years, there are about 2,000 delegates that get together in Beijing, and they select the top people, the top about 400 people for the Central Committee, which represents the elite decision-making bodies in China. And so that's what's happening this week at the Party Congress. All of these delegates are convening in Beijing, and they are selecting people for the top committees. At the end of this week, likely this weekend, the Party Congress will conclude, and there will be the first meeting of these top 400 or so people that will meet this weekend, and they will select from among them the candidates for the General Secretary, likely to be Xi Jinping, the Politburo Standing Committee, the Politburo, and other top leadership bodies. Now, the other reason why the Congress is important is it sets the priorities for the party for the next several years. And for that, for us China analysts, we get a little window into what's happening there in the top leadership. And so for that, we look at speeches, we look at personnel appointments. And so for several weeks after the Congress, China analysts will be furiously analyzing these documents and the meanings therein and what they tell us about elite politics and China's future priorities. So to date, a lot of the analysis we've seen of the Party Congress has focused on issues that are most interesting for Western audiences. So the possibility of Xi Jinping getting a third term as the General Secretary, or the future of China's zero COVID policy. Our panel today is going to focus on some slightly different aspects of the transition, such as foreign relations and its political system and the role of protests and resistance. And so to start us off, I thought that what I would do is adjust the frame a little bit and address how the party, how the CCP thinks about this meeting, why they think the next 5 years are going to be some of the most critical. And so for that, I will attempt to give us all an understanding of what they mean when they say certain dates and certain phrases. And to finish it off, I'll also address what it means for the United States and the East-West Center. So contrary to some analysts who claim that the Chinese system is inscrutable, in fact, the party has been telegraphing for weeks what it is going to be discussing at the Party Congress. The problem is that they describe it using language that even in English is often unintelligible for outside observers. So in this case, the party media has said that the Congress will produce, quote, a macro outlook on the two-step strategic arrangement for building a powerful, modern, socialist country in an all-around way. And China must do so against the backdrop of an international situation that it describes as, quote, complicated, grave, unusual, and extraordinary. So to unpack what all of this means, we need to understand the intersection of two issues that the party believes are the most consequential for China at present. And they are, first, the country's national rejuvenation, or its quest to regain a position of global power and influence that it last held during the height of the Qing dynasty. And second, what the party calls great changes unseen in centuries, that is, unprecedented and dangerous shifts in the international system. And President Xi Jinping refers to these two issues as the, quote, two overall situations. These influence each other. They are going to intensify in the coming years, and China must handle them very, very carefully. So first, I'll talk about national rejuvenation. And so national rejuvenation is a basic approach that the party has pursued since Mao's time. And it aims to restore China to national greatness after a century of humiliation at the hands of Western powers in the early 20th century. Over the course of history, China's leaders have pursued different approaches to national rejuvenation, sometimes wildly different approaches. So after Mao's victory against the Kuomintang in 1949, he consolidated the new People's Republic of China. However, his efforts to violently reform the party in the name of economic transformation nearly led to the destruction of the Chinese state. Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, who came to power after him, in 1978, shifted the party's focus from class struggle to economic modernization and launched reform and opening. Deng Xiaoping dramatically increased China's ties with the world. He accelerated China's economic development, and he made the Chinese people wealthy. So incidentally, at the East-West Center, these developments led to new partnerships with China, including technical and educational exchanges. path-breaking cooperative research in demographic studies, and the start of the China seminar lectures, which were once held at the Maple Garden restaurant and are now a series of online talks to let people know about China. Turning to Deng's successor, Jiang Zemin, in 1997, Jiang was the first to set two specific deadlines for national rejuvenation. And the party calls these the two centenary goals. They are in the party constitution, and they drive all of China's economic planning and its domestic and foreign policies. And they are, by 2021, the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, to achieve a moderately prosperous society, which is defined as doubling 2010 income per person or per capita GDP. And second, by 2049, or the 100th anniversary of China's, or the People's Republic of China's founding, to make China a modern socialist country that is, quote, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, and harmonious. So of course, when Xi Jinping took over as the leader of China, he had to put his own spin on the two centenary goals. To bridge this long 28-year gap between the goals, Xi in 2017 set a new interim target for 2035 for China to become a modern socialist power and a leader in economics, technology, and other fields. And he also demanded from officials that they meet some targets earlier than as previously scheduled. So it is this two-step plan, how to hit key targets for 2035 and set the country up for 2049, on which Xi and the party are hyper-focused this week during the party congress. So to give it a sense of the ambition of these goals, in just 13 years, China aims to be the world's largest economy, overtaking the United States by doubling the size of its economy and per capita income. It also hopes to be the global leader in innovation by bolstering scientific and technological self-reliance and achieving breakthroughs in key technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing, areas where China is already leading in many ways. It also hopes to be a dominant military power in Asia, capable of deterring threats on China's periphery, to include any perceived efforts at Taiwan independence. Also, a model ecological civilization, meeting its pledges to the UN on climate change and fully integrating environmental concerns with economic development after decades of breakneck economic growth that caused much pollution. And then finally, an education powerhouse by transforming the Chinese university system to be first in the world. So for Xi, his ability to reach these very ambitious goals is partly personal because it justifies him taking on what is going to be an expected third term as general secretary this week, which of course breaks with past precedent of his two recent predecessors. And then if that was not enough to give party cadres a sense of very serious urgency, they are also carrying out this agenda amidst more complex and risky external dynamics than China has experienced in many years. And when Xi Jinping talks about these dynamics, he calls them the great changes unseen in centuries. And this is the second of the two overall situations that I referenced earlier. In the party's eyes, these foundational shifts have been taking place in international relations, and they're akin to the structuring that took place after the two world wars of the 20th century and the fall of the Soviet Union. On one hand, these changes, they benefit China because they give Beijing more influence and they cast doubt on the staying power of China's rivals, namely the United States. And Chinese scholars see the international system shifting towards greater equality and greater multipolarity, where China and other developing countries will finally get their say in these formerly dominated Western institutions. But on the other hand, great changes also bring great risks, and risks are very much on Xi Jinping's mind. In his speech on Sunday to the Party Congress, he called on officials to be on the lookout for black swan and gray rhino events. And a gray rhino, it's an obvious danger that we ignore. This is a concept that was popularized in a 2016 book by an American author, and that book is now a #1 bestseller in China. And Xi Jinping talks about gray rhinos a great deal. In his speech, Xi identified some of these rhinos. They include internet public opinion that could spiral out of control, economic problems leading to social unrest, other countries interfering in China's affairs, threats to overseas investment, and endemic corruption, which Xi has called a cancer on the party itself. The party's greatest concern is not only that these threats are growing in number, but that they are more connected to one another. And so it is harder to prevent shocks outside of China from affecting events inside China. Now, the United States looms large in the party's mind when it thinks about these threats. For years, China regarded the United States as the country with the greatest potential to affect its future development, both in terms of opportunities from trade, education, and technology, and threats in America's ability to wield its influence to constrain China's choices. And so it's striking that China and the United States view the world right now with a similar sense of urgency. In the national security strategy that was released last week by the US government, it described the US as at an inflection point, and in the next 10 years, it described as a decisive decade. So what does it mean that leaders of both countries see themselves at such a crucial moment? First, if China can achieve its goals, the balance of power that will take place over the next decade will bring the two countries into increasingly high stakes competition, with a higher probability for competition to spill over into conflict than at any time in the last several decades. The Chinese military will be urgently training and fielding new capabilities during Xi's third term to meet targets by 2027, or the 100th anniversary of the PLA's founding. Military competition, while primarily concentrated in Asia, will be at the heart of many other aspects of US-China rivalry, including technological competition. And we can also expect to see greater competition for ideas about governance systems and values, as Xi has called on Chinese officials to give China a voice that matches its international status. And then second, we are entering a period where Chinese leaders will operate with a heightened awareness of risk and an increased urgency to control and deter external threats. So for Xi, that means insulating China's economy from external shocks, being more active in global governance reform, and calling on the military to strengthen deterrence, which could portend a more active military posture on China's periphery. To wrap it up, what do these dynamics mean for the East-West Center? Well, for 60 years, the center has enabled citizens of the United States, Asia, and the Pacific to understand and appreciate people they have never met. And that role is now more vital than ever with growing geopolitical competition. So I think there are many opportunities for the East-West Center, and I just wanted to focus on three. First, as the national security strategy states, the degree to which the US and China work together on global challenges like climate change is going to shape the future world order. However, even for non-government organizations like East-West Center, cooperation with China is getting more complex, especially with COVID travel restrictions, negative pressures on Chinese civil society, and as tensions rise, the need for institutions like the East-West Center to protect themselves and their affiliates from attempts to use them for undue influence or covert information gathering. And so I would recommend that the center have a long-term strategy for its China programs that mitigates the risks of both engaging and not engaging. And then second, the center's most important contributions may not even involve the United States and China. The East-West Center is very unique among US institutes because of the breadth of the Asia-Pacific leaders, governments, constituents that its work serves. And so the center could elevate voices from Asia and the Pacific to speak frankly to both Washington and Beijing. A meaningful outcome of this work would help the United States revise its or refine its vision for the Asia Pacific and make it attractive to other nations and reflect US interests. And then finally, the center's focus on multi-generational networks and enduring social and environmental questions really sets it apart from other think tanks who are more focused on current policy relevance or the crisis of the day. And this long-term view is very unique. And because all of these things that I just described are long-term challenges, I would argue that it is essential to have this long-term view to help the United States, China, and the region navigate the future. So that concludes my remarks. I'm happy to take any questions at the end of the session, but before that, I will turn it over to Dr. Roy to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Aloha to all those who are participating and observing and listening. I will make a few comments about the implications of the Party Congress for Chinese foreign policy as advertised, but let me first make a quick point about China's domestic politics. China is ruled by a party that calls itself the Chinese Communist Party, and Chinese officials describe China's political system as socialist, socialism with Chinese characteristics. But under Xi Jinping in particular, Xi's tenure, the Chinese political system is increasingly characterized as a classic fascist political system. I would say there are five qualifying criteria for a fascist system. First is a contempt for liberalism. We certainly see this in China. You may have heard of the notorious document number 9 that made the rounds among Chinese elites, which talks about how dangerous liberalism is for the future of the Chinese Communist Party. Second criterion is adulation of a strongman leader. And this is pretty obvious in the personality cult surrounding Xi Jinping. The third criterion is extreme nationalism. I think we see this present also in today's China. Everything is something with Chinese characteristics. Fourth criterion is the partnership between government and select industries. I think China can be described this way also. The political system basically could be described as crony capitalism, in which certain state-owned enterprises are favored by the government, have a special relationship. And the fifth criterion is the glorification of an aggressive foreign policy. So here too, we see, for example, both the Chinese government and the Chinese public seemingly all in on the idea of bringing Taiwan back under the control of the PRC by force if necessary. We see they're kind of a wolf warrior ethos, not even among Chinese diplomats, but among the Chinese public. The tagline for that film was, anybody who offends China, no matter how far away, must be punished. So I think we see all five of the criteria for fascism, all five of those boxes checked under this current government. Now, a couple of points about the implications of the Party Congress for China's foreign relations. One of the themes in Xi Jinping's long speech on Sunday was optimism about China's continued rise. A couple of key bits, quote, a significant shift is taking place in the international balance of power, presenting China with new strategic opportunities to further increase China's international standing and influence, unquote. Another, China will, quote, lead the world in comprehensive national strength and international influence, unquote, by 2050. A couple of important ramifications to this. First of all, you could say this is more dirt piled onto the grave of Deng Xiaoping. And what I mean by that is that Deng Xiaoping famously gave some foreign policy advice to his successors in China that included, don't take a leadership role, keep a low profile, and remain calm about things not going China's way, about perceived slights to China's honor. So at that time, while Deng Xiaoping's advice held sway, China was seemingly careful about alarming other countries. It was constrained somewhat by this worry. But now, under the Xi Jinping era, and now about to begin a third term, what we see is China striving for wins and mitigating damage as it is able to do so with its diplomacy. But the emphasis is on plunging ahead, getting these wins without worrying so much about frightening neighbors or other parts of the world. A second important ramification of this theme is that there is an argument that China is peaking economically, that within a few years, maybe 5 years, it will become clear that China's economy is slowing down dramatically from what we're accustomed to 6 to 8% annual growth to something like 2 or 3%, similar to what a mature economy like the United States has. And therefore, according to this idea, the Chinese leadership sees a closing window of opportunity when if they want to do something aggressive, make some important unilateral gain, they have to do it in the next few years. There's pressure on them to do it in the next few years, because otherwise the opportunity would be lost. China's economy won't be able to sustain a major effort that might include carrying out a long war once that window is shut. But if we're seeing that the Chinese government is optimistic about China's rise, if we're seeing that the Chinese leadership itself doesn't perceive that there's a closing window of opportunity, then we need not fear that there's this sense that they need to move quickly if they have any aggressive plans in the near future, which is a good thing from our perspective. Another theme in Xi's speech, along with the optimism about China's continued growth, was a pessimism, maybe even a greater pessimism than in recent years, about China's relationships with some important other countries, particularly the United States. For example, one of the quotes was, quote, "The hegemonic, high-handed, and bullying acts of using strength to intimidate the weak, taking from others by force and subterfuge, and playing zero-sum games are exerting grave harm," unquote. Another one, "There have been external attempts to blackmail, contain, blockade, and exert maximum pressure on China," unquote. Most of this refers to the United States of America. So the worry for Americans is that this seems to be consistent with belief that some of us have seen among Chinese elites, that as the gap in power between the United States closes, Chinese believe that the United States will become less tolerant to China's continued growth. And as the Chinese would put it, the United States will try harder to contain China. It's a pessimistic view that maximizes the likelihood of conflict between China and the United States in the future, because the Chinese believe that the United States will not tolerate a rejuvenated China, a China that has freedom of action in its own region. Then that leaves China no possibility for gaining those goals other than a warm conflict with the United States. I think this kind of view also helps explain why China has aligned itself with Russia during the Ukraine war. It makes Russia, which shares a lot of these objectives and somewhat of the Chinese mindset about the future of the international system, makes Russia an important enough ally for the United States that China is willing to suffer the hits to China's reputation by refusing to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, like much of the world has. Finally, what do we learn from this party Congress about China's orientation toward the problem of Taiwan? Some of the comments that she made during the speech about Taiwan include, quote, "We have resolutely opposed separatism," unquote, and, quote, "We have maintained the ability to steer cross-strait relations," unquote. I see those sentiments as positive because it suggests that Xi Jinping is making a case that the party has managed the cross-strait problem sufficiently well, that it's under control, that Xi himself does not feel under a great deal of pressure to do more, to act more aggressively as we would see it toward Taiwan. Xi Jinping continues to say that the quote, "best way," unquote, to get Taiwan back into the fold is through peaceful means. China, of course, refuses to renounce the use of force to settle the issue. But Xi Jinping made clear during his speech that the threat of the use of force is aimed at, quote, "a few separatists and foreign forces," unquote, not, quote, "Taiwan compatriots," unquote. So he's saying that we're only planning on killing a small number of people in Taiwan who deserve it and the Americans who might intervene, but we don't mean it against the entire Taiwan population. Now, this still evidences an extreme misunderstanding of the cross-strait relationship and how people in Taiwan feel about the possibility of being a part of the PRC. But it strikes me that There's nothing new here in Xi Jinping's most recent statements about China's orientation toward Taiwan. There's no sense of a deadline by which Xi feels like he needs to accomplish the annexation of Taiwan. And there's no particular urgency, at least in the verbiage of the associated with the 20th Party Congress, for China to settle this issue on its own terms. In fact, I almost feel that the leadership might have consciously attempted to reduce the tensions a little bit regarding the cross-strait issue. Thank you.
Aloha and 大家好. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm going to share some of my thoughts about recent and potential protest and dissent in China, and also broader public political attitudes and behavior. Most of what we've heard so far, and most of what we hear about Xi Jinping and the 20th National Party Congress through the mass media and from scholars, focuses on negative developments. Those include Xi's accumulation of power, suppression of dissent, monopolization of policy direction, international saber rattling, and misguided policies like zero COVID. And I don't contest or challenge any of these analyses. They're all accurate, but at the same time, they often downplay or omit more beneficial and popular policies under Xi. I think it's important to remember that even under Xi, the Chinese Communist Party has remained responsive, generally speaking, to public grievances. And this is because Xi and other top party leaders recognize that it is easier to remain in power if the party satisfactorily addresses popular concerns. And as Kim noted in her talk, Xi and other party elites are well aware of potential so-called gray rhino dangers to Communist Party rule, including internet public opinion spiraling out of control, or economic problems leading to social unrest. Party authorities continually monitor society both on the ground and online so as to be aware of popular complaints and to nip them in the bud. How do they do this? They do this in part by repressing individuals who voice dissent, but importantly, also by making efforts to address underlying public problems or concerns. So a few examples of more beneficial and popular policies under Xi. First, his anti-corruption campaign. Again, we mostly hear about this campaign in the context of Xi's use of it to target, punish, and incapacitate any potential threats to his leadership among Chinese Communist Party elites. What gets less press is that the anti-corruption campaign also has demonstrably reduced overt corruption as experienced by ordinary people. There has been a notable decline in ostentatious displays of abuse of public funds by local officials, reduction in building grandiose government structures, local officials driving around in fancy cars, going out for expensive dinners. So this has really had a positive impact on the party's image among common people as a result of Xi's anti-corruption campaign. Xi also has undertaken an extensive anti-rural poverty campaign. This involves sending hundreds of thousands of government staff to visit poor rural areas, speak with residents, also speak with local officials, develop targeted poverty alleviation plans. And studies have shown that rural poverty, as defined by the regime, was eradicated in 2020, and the lives of tens of millions of China's rural poor have been greatly improved. Third arena of beneficial and popular policies have been efforts undertaken under the Xi administration to address environmental problems. All right, so those are some positives that I think we need to remember and weigh them against many of the negatives that we tend to more frequently hear about. So how about popular attitudes and behavior related to the CCP's COVID policies and practices? We have seen some evidence of public protest and resistance. There have been reports documented by citizens using their phones of street protests in cities like Shenzhen and Wuhan and Chongqing. In some cases, dozens of people, and others hundreds and even thousands of people taking to the streets. These have generally been short-lived, but at times have involved violent clashes with local authorities or police forces. We've also seen some signs more isolated of protest and resistance in other cities. In Shanghai, during the long 2-month lockdown from March to May of 2022, we saw some banners, we saw some isolated instances of individuals protesting. Also, a short mini documentary called Voices of April came out online that was harshly critical of the government's mishandling of the lockdown in Shanghai. It went viral before it was scrubbed on the Chinese internet, but you can still find it and watch it if you just want to Google and look for it, Voices of April. In Beijing, there also have been some isolated incidents of protests related to COVID lockdowns. About 200 Beijing University students in May left their dorms to protest the construction of a wall on campus that was supposed to cordon them off and lock them down while staff and faculty were able to circulate more freely on campus. The wall ultimately was not finished and the protest ended peacefully. There have also been isolated incidents of graffiti appearing in Beijing on COVID testing centers. But overall, COVID lockdown-related protests have been localized, and they have focused on the lockdown and generally not the Chinese Communist Party-led political system. In addition to this, these lockdown-related protests have come and gone as the lockdowns have come and gone. How about resistance related to the current National Party Congress meeting? Well, I'm sure everybody who made the effort to tune into this webinar is aware of the 2 banners that were strung on the Sitong Bridge on the Third Ring Road in Beijing on October 13th. One of the banners read, this is loosely translated, "Food, not COVID tests, freedom, not lockdowns, dignity, not lies, reform, not cultural revolution, elections, not rulers, citizens, not slaves." Then there was a second banner which read, "Student and worker strike to remove the traitor, Xi Jinping." The person who hung the banners, we're not entirely sure who the person was, but there are reports that the banners were hung by a 48-year-old Beijing man named Peng Zaizhou, and supposedly he is an employee in the technical department of a Beijing technical company. If it's true that he is the person that hung the banners, he also spoke the slogans of the banners through a megaphone and did something to create smoke to draw attention to the bridge, and lots of people passing by videoed it again with their phones. If it was indeed this person, and he is indeed 48 years old, that means that in 1989, he was 15 years old and most likely was a resident of Beijing at the time. So he probably was a witness to and possibly even a participant in the 1989 protests. So this protest, these 2 banners, has gotten a lot of news. If you Google it, it's all over the place. Why has it gotten so much coverage? Because it is so rare. And we have not seen any sign of wider public societal resistance in China surrounding the National Party Congress. There has been a lot of chatter online, for example, the hashtag with the hashtag I saw it, meaning I witnessed these banners. And there have been a lot of posters with the slogans on them actually coming up around the United States on many US campuses, university campuses. It's not certain who's been posting them. I've heard some reports that it is the Falun Gong, but we'll see how this all plays out. Okay, a few more general points with regard to prospects for public resistance to Chinese Communist Party rule. First of all, if we are to see any kind of resistance of this nature, what groups would be most likely to lead and participate in these kinds of protests? And it is my feeling that the group with the most potential to publicly resist and push for system change are people like supposedly this person who hung the banners, whose formative years were in the late 1970s and 1980s, and who are now in their 40s and 50s, people who potentially participated in or witnessed the 1989 protests. Another thing to keep in mind as we contemplate the potential for public protest and resistance toward Chinese Communist Party rule is whether or not there are appealing and viable alternatives in the minds of the Chinese public. Domestically, Xi has further suppressed civil society, dissent, and all potential elite Chinese Communist Party challenges to his rule. So domestically, there is really little alternative to the status quo apart from other Chinese Communist Party leaders potentially taking over from Xi. Externally, in recent years, liberal democracies have not seemed to do a better job of handling crises, managing the economy, and even representing the populace in some cases. And this is continually, of course, reinforced in party propaganda. And while it is exaggerated and biased in the propaganda, it has more than a kernel of truth in terms of the failings of liberal democratic systems at present. So, in conclusion, unless and until an appealing and viable alternative arises, my prediction is that the most likely scenario is resigned acceptance of the political status quo with periodic outbursts of anger towards specific policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, Danny, and Teresa for the excellent and insightful talk on this landmark meeting. So now let's move on to the Q&A session. We have a lot of questions from the audience. And the first question from the audience pertains to Xi's fourth term. And the question is, what indications during the Congress did we get about his potential fourth term? And if not, what indications did you perceive about their heir apparent? Anyone would like to volunteer to answer this first question?
So I'll offer some really quick thoughts on that. So when we talk about Xi Jinping's fourth term, so Xi Jinping holds the three top positions in China: the head of the party, the president of the PRC, and the chairman of the Central Military Commission. So when we say Xi Jinping's fourth term, it's likely that we're referring to him as taking a fourth term as the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. So what he's looking for during this party congress is a third term as general secretary. His fourth term as general secretary would be in 2027. So speculating, it's a long way to speculate out, but I think there's some things that we can watch for. The South China Morning Post reported this morning that there would be a larger than expected turnover in the Politburo Standing Committee in terms of new people joining. You could see that, of course, you'd have to look at the ages and the identities of who those people are, but you could see that as Xi moving in some potential successors now to potentially take over for him if he so chooses after his next term. But again, you could also see that as an indication of him staying, depending if those people who are taking over do not have their own networks, or if they're wholly beholden to him. That could be an indication that he might want to stay on in the next 5 years. He might just be testing them out to see how they do, and he could make a decision over the next couple of years. Another thing I would watch is what kinds of positions those individuals take. So in the past, the leader in waiting has been appointed as a vice chairman of the Central Military Commission. If we were to see Xi appoint a successor, we could likely see that person take on a similar kind of responsibility with the military, or perhaps another post where they would be tested out as a future general secretary. And then I just think finally, there is a detectably darker outlook in this Party Congress speech, as as I noted and my fellow panelists have noted. And that could have a number of reasons, but one of them is that she is priming people for this justification that only he can save the Communist Party. And so with that kind of justification, with that darker security environment in mind, you could see a situation in 5 years where the justification is still that if you don't have continuity, then China will fail in its goals. And so I think that ultimately, talking about that darker security environment gives him that flexibility to stay on if he wishes to.
Teresa and Danny, did you want to build on Kim's response? Okay, let's move on to the second question, and I'm going to direct the second question to Danny. It pertains to Taiwan. What is the likelihood that China take over Taiwan in the next 5 years? And does it matter which political party is in charge of our country, whether China invades Taiwan?
As to the second part of the question, I don't think it matters much which of the two major parties is in power in the United States. From China's point of view, the foreign policies carried out by either party toward Asia and toward China are quite similar. I would say now more than ever, China's the commitment to take a tougher policy toward China is a bipartisan position in the United States. What happens in the next 5 years? Of course, a lot depends on what might happen in the United States and what might happen in Taiwan. China is actually the most consistent of the three players in this triangle. China's policy toward Taiwan has changed very little over the last 3 decades, whereas lots of change is possible. For example, in Taiwan, if the Kuomintang is in charge versus the Democratic Progressive Party. But generally speaking, I think China has no particular interest in rushing to attempt to use a military solution to try to annex Taiwan, but will consider that option if China feels pushed. And at the moment, I think China does feel pushed because China interprets American policy over the last 5 years or so as trying to permanently eliminate the possibility of Taiwan peacefully joining the People's Republic of China, moving to, as the Chinese would put it, to consolidate Taiwan separatism. So the best way to avoid that, this takes into account one of the other questions, which is how does the United States avoid a conflict with China in the near future? The single best way to do that, Taiwan being the major possibility of a warm conflict between China and the United States, would be for the United States and Chinese governments to reach a kind of an understanding regarding Taiwan that is similar to maybe the way the situation was a decade or so ago. If the American side can convince the Chinese side that it isn't a vital strategic interest of the United States for Taiwan to be independent, which I think the Chinese believe now, on the one hand, and on the other hand, if the U.S. government can also persuade the Chinese that when you take aggressive looking steps, military signaling toward Taiwan, that has the effect of increasing our sense that we need to prepare to go to war against China over Taiwan. Therefore, if you were to curtail those kinds of activities, it would be easier for us to settle down into kind of both sides honoring the status quo kind of situation. That more than any other single policy focus, I think, would do the most to decrease the chances of a warm conflict between China and the United States in the next few years.
Got it. Thank you. Anyone would like to build on Danny's response? Okay, we'll move on to this next question. Next question is more for Kim and maybe Teresa as well. The question is your assessment that China sees a world a more conducive to its interests or a more risky to its interests? Kim mentioned both. Is there a sense of confidence or anxiety? Another question is also, will PRC pull back from announced interest in the CCP? Kim, would you like to address this question first?
I think the questioner probably meant TPP, I'm guessing. Or CPTPP.
CCP.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I have not been following the PRC's approach to the to the trade agreement very closely. But I will try to address or do they see it as, or do they see the environment as more conducive or more risky to their interests? And I think this is solidly both. So when Xi Jinping is talking about these great changes, he talks about all the ways in which they're conducive to China's development. So allowing greater participation by countries like China and developing countries in these international institutions that China believes were always dominated by Western powers, just giving a more balance to the international system. The advent of advanced technologies. Xi Jinping thinks that technology is going to be the decisive factor in who is in charge and who has most influence in the global system in the years to come. And there are a number of other things that the Chinese see as in their interests, but these changes also bring a lot of risks. The Chinese Communist Party really believes that its core advantage over other political systems is in its Marxist worldview, its ability to diagnose these trends in the international system and devise policies that go along and complement the trends. And they really view others, including the United States, as just being unable to grasp those trends, and in some cases going wholly against them. So I think the outlook for Xi, at least, is that as long as the Communist Party can continue to correctly diagnose these trends and go along with the way that they're heading, then it will be in a good place. But there are many dangerous obstacles up ahead that China will have to contend with.
Got it. Thank you.
Can I add one bit?
Yeah.
I agree with Kim. It's both. It's seemingly 50-50. China is doing well. We're on the correct course, but at the same time, the international environment has become less friendly. What's really significant about that is that not too long ago, the general Chinese view was that the international environment is relatively friendly. There's a period of strategic opportunity, meaning we can safely concentrate on rebuilding, and nobody's planning on attacking or invading us. So we have a space in which we can grow without opposition. But I think the view now is that the opposition has returned now. So we're going to face serious headwinds from here on out, and it gets back to the theory that I think is operative now in China, that the Americans were relatively tolerant of our relationship in which we gain more from the Americans than they gain from us while we were weak. But now that we're strong and that gap has been narrowed, the Americans are less tolerant of that arrangement and are pushing back more heavily.
Okay, let's move on to the next question involving China and the US in terms of technology. And the question is, how do you see the competition between China and the US in technology in the next 5 years? And how should technological companies prepare for it? Anyone would like to answer this question? I think this question is more for Kim, so I'm going to direct this question back to Kim.
Yeah, I think, I don't have a lot of specifics, but I do know that, Xi Jinping sees technology as key. There's a term called the fourth industrial revolution, right? That describes how new kinds of technology will come to allow different countries to dominate the international order. And so if you look at things like China's 14th five-year plan and its vision for 2035, technology, science and technology and innovation is core in that. And it is front and center of Xi Jinping's speeches. He talks about it all the time. And so I do think that this is going to be a major push, a major issue for China in the coming years. And it will also be for the United States. And so I think that you can expect to see a lot more in that space.
Teresa, did you want to build on Kim's response? Okay, no, Danny? Okay, next question, with China becoming more aggressive in its foreign policy, I have seen an all-round de-link has become a new normal between US and China. With that in mind, would the ambition of the corresponding pattern with the US engagement with China, both in public and private arenas? What would the envision corresponding patterns of US engagement with China in both public and private arenas? This question is also up for grab. Any volunteers?
Well, I would just assert that we're not going to see an all-around decoupling between the United States and China. What we're seeing on the Chinese side is that the Chinese for some years have been preparing for the possibility of themselves being no longer dependent on the United States and other potential adversaries for vital supplies. And more recently, the United States, rather than just talking about that, taking steps to do the same. But what we are seeing now and likely to see in the future is very targeted delinking in some very specific sectors. And even in those instances, we're going to find that even that very limited decoupling is very, very difficult. So for example, we're constantly seeing news stories revealing that the United States is still pouring into China know-how and expertise on some important technology that has obvious military implications, despite what we've been talking about for the last few years. So even this very limited delinking and decoupling will be very, very painful, take a very long period of time. But this is one area where what we call the new Cold War, the present Cold War, is different from the more famous, capital C, capital W Cold War, which involved an economic embargo, between the United States and its allies and the Soviet bloc and its allies. The United States and China continue to trade massively. The United States continues to have a massive trade deficit with China in its bilateral trade. That's unlikely to change. The depth of economic interaction and the amount of time over which it's taken place will likely never be completely severed. But the United States and China have reached the point where they will sacrifice areas in which they would both gain by cooperation because they're afraid of the other side gaining more.
Got it. This is just a lot of logistic questions. Both Kim and Teresa is able to stay for 10 more minutes. Danny, are you able to stay for additional 10 more minutes? Yes, okay. And I would like to balance the discussions and give an opportunity to Teresa to also respond. So I'm going to jump to a question about protest on COVID. Given the protests about COVID, are people such as students not aware of how valuable tests and vaccinations are. Are people getting their shots, and are a third boosters available, and are people required to get their shots?
Well, I can answer a few of those questions. I think the Chinese public is very concerned about COVID, and that's part of the reason why we haven't seen more protests related to lockdowns and persistent frequent testing requirements, etc., is that the Chinese Communist Party has successfully convinced the population that you don't want to get COVID, that it's very dangerous, and that's why the party is undertaking these very strict measures. So the protests haven't been resisting getting vaccinated or getting tested. The protests have targeted the way that the lockdowns have been handled in such a way that people have had a hard time getting food and kind of basic necessities. So that is what the focus of the protests have been. The one thing about the vaccinations is that, at least as of present, the Chinese government has refused to allow the mRNA vaccines in China. So it's not just a question of whether or not people are getting vaccinated, and there's still a pretty significant portion of the population that is not vaccinated, but also the effectiveness of the vaccinations that are available. So I think if there is to be any kind of moving away from these strict zero COVID related policies, there will have to be a more concerted effort on the part of the government to ensure that everyone is vaccinated with an effective vaccination, because otherwise to relax the strict zero COVID policies probably would result in a dramatic uptick in the number of COVID cases.
Thank you. The next question involves Russia. And how do you gauge a potential enhanced Sino-Russia relationship in terms of its effects on US foreign policy and international relations? Kim, Danny, any of you would like to volunteer to answer this question?
Denny, I defer to you on that one.
China and Russia share some fundamental goals and see themselves each as key supporters in opposing the domination of what they would call parts of the U.S. agenda, which I think we prefer to think of as liberal principles that a lot of countries prefer to be associated with. Prevent those principles from dominating the making of international rules and governing international relations. So while historically it is not a natural partnership between China and Russia, in its various forms, and there have been and still are lots of potential for friction between those two countries if they choose to focus on their differences. That goal of supporting each other in opposition to the domination of that U.S. agenda, which they both find it in their own interest to oppose, has been the glue that holds them together. And the Ukraine experience, the Ukraine war experience, probably has mixed effects. On the one hand, China was sort of forced to it claims to and tries to not take a side, but it was really forced to choose sides here, and basically sided with the Russians. And the Russians found that the Chinese took some hits in doing so. So in some ways, it will be one of those experiences that communist parties like to say contributes to a friendship forged in blood as we fought together on the ideological battlefield. But at the same time, it clarifies for the Chinese that there are going to be some difficulties associating themselves with the Putin regime. So in the immediate future, it's an experience that I think ties those two more closely together, because the Chinese have been forced to choose that side. But I think we still should not lose sight of the fact that historically these are not countries that ordinarily get along together. And what we see in the future is an increasingly economically and ideologically and politically dominant China that threatens to make inroads even into areas that the Russians consider part of their traditional sphere of influence. So lots of scope for increased tensions between these two countries. If somehow in the future there's a possibility of some kind of a reconciliation between a future Russian government and the liberal West, including both Western Europe and the United States, that the situation could change. So long term, the possibility for those tensions and a China-Russia split remains a permanent and eternal likelihood. But in the short term, current circumstances have continued to force them together.
Thank you. The next question is directed towards Kim. Any indications on potential issues of strategic cooperation between China and the US beyond mitigating the impact of climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that both sides are holding out the possibility of cooperation in some areas, despite the rising tensions. And the national security strategy lays out some of them, climate change being a big one. Unfortunately, there was some pullback on the Chinese side about the climate change dialogue post Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So I guess we'll have to see whether those types of discussions are going to proceed. I think that the Chinese, I mentioned in my remarks that they've always seen the United States as both an opportunity and a threat, and they're very careful to try to have elements of their bilateral cooperation and their approach with us that will stabilize other areas of the relationship. And so I do see that, I do think that they will, potentially try to still have some areas of stabilization, even though things are getting more tense and I guess just more competitive between us. There will, hopefully still be, some areas where at least communications are happening.
Got it. We have about 2 minutes left. And the last question is, what are the chances that Chinese companies are delisted from our markets, perhaps as a form of some type of retaliation? And also, what can we, the United States, do about the ongoing ethnic cleansing of the Uyghur Muslims? This question is also up for grab. Anybody would like to answer this last question?
I'll take there are two questions there, really. I'll take the first one.
Okay.
So we see already that there's a for several years there's been pressure, and now there's been recent U.S. action in requiring Chinese companies that seek to be embedded in the U.S. economy, parts of people's retirement portfolios and so on, that they adhere to what we would call the same basic standards that we would require of other companies like U.S. companies. And there's been a lot of Chinese resistance to that. So it's required some negotiation. But there's already a lack of appetite in the United States to continue to treat Chinese companies that want involvement in the U.S. in the U.S. economy as having privileges that their American counterparts do not live up to. Now that's in peacetime. I think there's the possibility for an additional level of exclusion, of Chinese companies from U.S. economic activity, but it would probably require a wartime situation to bring that into effect. But that would be something more like an embargo, something like what the United States attempted to enforce during the Second World War, forbidding American companies from doing business with Germany, and we're completely successful. There were still some that did, but we would move from the current situation of trying to make the playing field fair, and along with that, trying to remove American vulnerability to China, reliance on China for vital supplies, to the additional level of simply not doing business with China because it might help the Chinese get stronger, even though, again, we might benefit from it. But again, I think it would take a war for us to move to that level.
Got it. Thank you. And our time is up. I realize there's a lot of questions left unanswered, but we unfortunately have to end the session here. Thank you very much, Kim, Danny, and Teresa, for sharing your thoughts on China's 20th Party Congress, and also big thanks to our audience for joining us and participating today. And I would like to invite everyone back to our EWC Insights on November 16th for a talk by Jennifer Turner. And until then, have a wonderful day, everyone.